Hello everyone, welcome to our talk on understanding cross-lingual syntactic transfer in multilingual recurrent neural networks. Before we dive into the research questions, just a brief introduction. So, multilingual neural NLP models are for the form of, let's say, language models or NMT systems that can be successfully trained on a mix of data from that arise from multiple languages, and these models do not need any major architectural changes. So in the case, we can have an NMT, multilingual NMT system, where we have on the input side Italian and English, which can be translated to English and Korean. These models have quite a few advantages. One advantage is that in this case we would have fewer models to maintain, and it's also an easy way to transfer knowledge from high resource languages to low resource languages. In the past few years, there have been quite a few number of success stories. The major one that comes to mind is mbird and also XLM, so which provide us multilingual contextualized word representations. There are, however, still a few open issues that are yet to be solved. One would be to find out what is the trade-off between what we say as the positive interference, where we have linguistic transfer between the languages, and negative transfer, where we have some kind of interference between these languages. And also, question is, do all languages benefit from such kind of multilingual training? So the question was mostly is, so do such kind of NLP models generate some kind of common grammar between the languages? So in psycholinguistics, several studies have shown that in the multilingual mind, the linguistic information is stored together, and they also interact with one another at all levels, so from phonetics right up to semantics. So a question naturally arises is, can we see the same happening in neural networks between the activations in the neural networks, the weights? So to that end, we try to provide answers to these two research questions. One is, do we see any implicit transfer of syntactic knowledge in in L2, let's say, given the exposure to a related first language? And secondly, do we find a common shared representational space between these languages when the categories between them are shared? So regarding the first question, we take the case of what I previously mentioned, is the interaction seen in the human mind, and where it has also been shown that the syntax has been shown to be shared. So this could be, for example, the first language of Spanish can also be a bilingual speaker would have the similar information being stored for English. So to look at this case, if there is an implicit knowledge transfer, we take the case of long range agreement. So this there was a long range agreement task from Gulordava 2018, wherein there were sentences such as, the boys who were lost in the forest were found or was found. So in this case, the where is the correct verb form, and given a language model with the next word prediction task, the language model would be evaluated if it predicts the where with a higher probability than was. If so, then we say that it's able to predict on this long range task. There were also two conditions on this task. One was, there were two types of sentences: original, so sentences naturally occurring in a corpus, and nonsensical sentences, so wherein an original sentence's subject and or object were replaced randomly. So we would have something like the trucks who were welcomed in the pocket were or was solved. So there are no semantic cues in such sentences, but they are still nonetheless syntactic, and this was available for 4 languages. So what we assume is that should a language model predict well on this agreement task, then it is taken to be as proof of implicit complex grammatical knowledge being stored by the neural network. So these language models in our experiments were trained on 2 languages. We have a helper L1 and the target L2. So in our target, in the language models are tested on the second language, which in our case are Italian and Russian. So these are the agreement benchmarks from the Gulordava dataset. And the French, in our case for first language, we take French as a common language for both of these language models. So the ones being tested on Italian or Russian. And along with that, we have bilingual models. So for example, Spanish and Italian trained and then tested on Italian, and then Russian and Ukrainian tested on Russian. In all these cases, the second language is under-resourced when we compare it to the first language. All the language models in this experiment were a 2-layer LSTM, and that was trained on Wikipedia data. So we first look at the Italian results. So the main comparison always would be between the blue bars and the orange bars. So the blue bars represent the small L2 model, and the orange bars represent the bilingual models, which is a mix of L1 and then the under-resourced L2. And we also compare them to a much larger L2 model, so in this case, which is Italian large. And also on the left side, we see the agreement results for the original sentences, that is again, which are with semantic cues or naturally occurring sentences. And on the right hand side, we have the nonsensical sentences where there are no semantic cues. So we do, in the case of Italian, we do see an improvement in the bilingual Spanish-Italian model, where there is an improvement from 79.4 to 80.7, and it's even better than the larger Italian model in this case. However, the French-Italian models perform worse on both settings, perhaps showing an effect of language relatedness here, where Spanish is said to be more related to Italian than French. Moving on to Russian, we in this case, however, see no such improvement particularly for the case of nonsensical sentences. We do not see an improvement in the bilingual models, where there is a dip in accuracy for both the French-Russian model and the Ukrainian-Russian model. So here we find that language relatedness did not play a major role. After the conclusion of this experiment, we did find that there were a few limitations. One is that a lot of performance variations were found across different initializations of the model. That could be due to the dataset being small, and the major factor could have been that the task itself is complex, because agreement is said to be more complex as a task is more complex as the system or even humans. We need to first learn about the subject-verb agreement rules. That would mean that learning the lexical number of categories and so on. So then we decided to take a step back and perhaps focus on a much more simpler task, which is then we move on to the second question of our paper, which is In short, do we see syntactic categories shared amongst languages? So the assumption, as mentioned, was if we share the basic categories, that would enable us to transfer much more complex syntactic categories or knowledge, such as agreement. So to this end, we looked at classifiers that were trained on the task of part of speech label classification from the Universal Dependency Tree Bank. So the task was always we train it on L1 and test it on L2. So this would be like the question we were asking is that are, for example, French and Italian adjectives recognized by the same neural activations in the model? We looked at few fact explaining factors. So one would be like, for example, the effect of training objective. We looked at does the training objective play a role, such as the difference between if we have the task of next word prediction versus translating to a third common language. Also looked at the effect of language relatedness, for example, between French and Italian and French and German. And finally, also looking at the number of input languages. So initially, when we have two languages, so French and Italian on the source side compared to 9 languages on the source side. So in our case, 4 Romance languages, 4 Germanic languages, and 1 Uralic language. So for this experiment, we looked at the Europal data, and we had a 4-layer LSTM, which was bidirectional, so that we had a bidirectional language model trained as well as neural machine translation models. So looking at the effect of the training objective, so the blue bars here represent when on these models, when we just look at training on the part of speech categories and then testing on the part of speech categories for the same language, and then on the orange bars would be when trained on the first language and then tested on the second language. For what we see here is that language models are better at preserving the part of speech in the second language. So for example, that would be comparing 97 versus 92. However, translation does yield to better cross-lingual transfer, wherein we see a 4% increase for the between language modeling and translation. When we look at the effect of relatedness and number of input languages, we find that increasing the languages, so from 2 input languages to 9 input languages, it does not necessarily correspond to an increase in accuracy. So for example, looking at French to Italian, from the 2 language setup to 9, there is a decrease when we look at the monolingual transfer, but we do still see an increase. And on the other hand, we do see an increase when looking at the cross-lingual transfer. And secondly, there is a big change, or we do see a big change in accuracy when we look at the language relatedness. So when we look at French to Italian versus French to German, we see that yes, there is a 40% decrease in the cross-lingual accuracy. So summing up, in our paper, we looked for evidence of if syntactic space is shared when we train a multilingual NLP model, so language models and NMT models in this case. And for our first question, we found that when looking at long range agreement transfer, there is little evidence for that, in that only when the languages when the languages are quite related to one another, we do see an evidence of linguistic transfer. But when we look at unrelated languages, or when we look at not completely related languages, for example French and Italian, we see that the transfer is quite limited, only to when we have grammatical and semantically sentences that make sense. For our second question, we find that syntactic categories do not appear to be shared. And that's it. Thank you.